welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today, we're going to look at the end of the year a little bit differently than I usually do. You guys know that most weeks I'm doing dynamics and trauma and attachment and consent and all of these things, and how the psychology underneath it all and the choices that people are making inside of their relationships. But today I'm not doing that anymore. We're going to talk about this year, what it's meant, the conversations we've had, right? It's a little bit of a pause here, right? This is the last episode of the year, and I want to take some time to reflect on what this past year's of conversations has actually revealed. Not a recap of every episode I've done, not all, a list of all the themes, just the patterns that kept showing up no matter what the topic was. And across dozens of episodes, what stood out wasn't the lack of information. People know the language. You all understand the ideas. What kept coming up instead of how hard it was to live inside of what we already know, especially when our bodies and our habits and histories pull us in another direction. But before I go any further, I want to take a moment just to say thank you. This show has continued to grow this year because people stayed with conversations that definitely aren't easy. They're not comfortable, right? If you've been listening quietly, sharing these episodes, or coming back week after week, I appreciate that, and I see you. And as I always do, if you do find value in these conversations, follow me on Spotify, right? On the app, link it, hit it 5 stars. Follow me on YouTube, follow me on Apple, rate the show, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get notified when the new episodes come out, right? And if you want to support the show, there is a donation link in the show's description. That support helps me keep doing the work that stays grounded and honest. So today, I'm going to talk about briefly what made this year a little bit more clear and where my own stance kind of shifted in a lot of the things. And I'm going to open it up to a short AMA. A lot of questions have actually got from around the world, which I was really surprised and happy to. These are going to be a lot of the general questions. So there's not going to be a lot of personal solutions, right? But I'm going to answer them at the level of the patterns rather than advice. So let's get started first here with what about this year made it hard to ignore, right? So if I had to name this year in one sentence, it's going to be this. This was the year it became clear how big the gap is between what people want and what they can actually tolerate. Now, across nearly every conversation I had this year, people knew what they wanted. They wanted safety and connection, clarity and agency. You all could name the concepts, you can repeat the language, but knowing didn't translate into living it nearly as often as they expected. Now, what showed up instead was how quickly the nervous system takes over when those wants are tested, when closeness feels uncertain, even when the power shifts here. When someone doesn't respond the way we hoped, insight didn't interrupt nearly as much as people thought it would. And that's not a failure of intelligence or effort here. It's really about regulation. So this year, it made it hard to ignore that most struggles that people are facing weren't about a lack of education. They were about limits of tolerance or emotional capacity, limits in how much about ambiguity or restraint or disappointment someone can sit with before maybe reverting to an old pattern. And that showed up in kink. It showed up in relationships. It showed up in our communities. People reached for structures and roles and rules, hoping those would create safety. And when those structures didn't deliver the feeling they were chasing, the disappointment often turned inward or outward instead of being examined. And another thing that became very clear this year was how much overfunctioning is still being mistaken for maturity. Being the steady one, the accommodating one, or the person who just explains, waits, and you adapt and absorb, on the surface, that can all look like regulation. But underneath, a lot of people were quietly burning out and telling themselves they were just being patient or evolved. But from my end, what stood out wasn't how much people were learning. It was how much they were struggling to slow down long enough to notice what their bodies were telling them. right? That hesitation, tension, even how fatigued they were. The quiet that no one that, keeps getting overridden by logic or loyalty. So if this year had a lesson, it wasn't about doing kink better or relationships better. It was about respecting limits sooner, the internal ones, not just the stuff we negotiate, and recognizing that growth doesn't come from pushing harder, but from noticing where pushing has already cost too much. And that's the ground everything else this year sat on. Now, I know I promised you all a conversation I was trying to get. Unfortunately, some of the logistics didn't work out, but that's okay. I'm hoping to have some more conversations and interviews in this upcoming year in 2026. Um, what else did this year reveal? When I look back over this year, one of the cleanest things that stood out is how often people tried to use structure as a substitute for safety. The rules, the roles, right? Agreements, protocols, not because those things are inherently bad, but because they felt like something solid to hold on to when uncertainty showed up. And a lot of people seem to believe that if they could just get the structure right, they would that feeling is going to follow. If rules were there, the roles were defined, if everyone just knew their place, that anxiety was going to settle. And sometimes that does work, but it's only temporary. But over and over, what I saw was the structure couldn't carry what people were asking it to carry because structure doesn't regulate our nervous system. It doesn't repair our old wounds. It doesn't create trust on its own. And when people leaned on that too hard, it makes things worse. So when something goes wrong, the response wasn't curiosity or reflection. It was often blame. And someone broke the rules or they didn't do it right, or there was, the container was failed, right? What kept getting missed and a lot of what I saw this year was that discomfort wasn't coming from lack of structure, but it was coming from a lot of uncertainty that people were feeling. That from vulnerability was not, sometimes being overridden. And no amount of rules can remove that entirely. And they can support it, but they can't replace it. And another pattern that kept showing up this year was how much overfunctioning still gets mistaken for health. Being steady or patient or the person who always understands or adapts and waits and explains and carries more than their share. And again, on the surface here, this looks like regulated and it's even maybe admirable, but underneath, a lot of people were exhausted. And I heard that throughout the year. And I hear it in the questions and I saw it in the dynamics and the people who are constantly managing their emotional temperature of the room, tracking everybody else's needs and holding space while shrinking their own. And if they just constantly told themselves, hey, I'm being mature and I'm being compassionate, when really they're just afraid to stop. And what this year made clear is that care and responsibility are not the same thing. Caring about someone doesn't mean carrying them. Understanding someone doesn't mean absorbing the cost of their choices. And being steady doesn't mean being endless. A lot of the burnout didn't come from conflict. It came from restraint, from holding back, from tolerating situations that, you know, the body just wanted to, right? More than it wanted to. From staying because leaving felt somehow selfish or because things weren't bad enough to just justify change. And this wasn't just about relationships. It showed up in our communities, our kink spaces. Pardon me, guys. Our friendships and our families. People take on roles they never agreed to, then feeling resentful without knowing why, or feeling guilty, wanting less responsibility or less emotional labor, less fixing. From my perspective, what stood out wasn't a lack of insight, but people just want to understand these dynamics on a real level. And what was harder was respecting limits early before things escalated, right? Internal limits, the energy, the emotional shifts, the point where something starts to feel heavy instead of nourishing. And this year it was harder to ignore how often people overrode those signals because they think they should just handle more. But that's never the case. It never fixes it, right? If there's a thread that's running through all of this, It's that safety doesn't come from getting things perfect. It comes from paying attention sooner to your discomfort or fatigue or the ways that your body goes quiet before your mind even catches up. That's what kept surfacing this year. And that's not a lesson to master, but more so something to notice, right? And what shifted for me this year? Now, it's a big question, and I sometimes even sit and reflect with myself throughout the year. So, one thing that did shift for me was that I stopped trying to persuade people who were already resisting what they were hearing, not in a dramatic way, just, quietly. I noticed how much energy was going into explaining the same things over and over to people who understood the words but weren't ready to live the implications of them. And you all heard a new segment on my show that started covering this, right? And earlier on, I probably spent more time trying to bridge that gap. I would rephrase, I gave people examples. Didn't matter. I presented facts. I would show research. It didn't matter, right? It was coming at it, the same idea from different angles, hoping that something was going to land with people. And over time, it just became clear that when someone is committed to not tolerating the truth, no matter how much clarity in the world I'm going to present is going to make any difference. And all of that just turned to a lot of noise. So I stopped pushing insight where it wasn't wanted, not out of frustration, but out of respect for reality. And people change when they're ready, not when something is explained well enough, right? Now, along with that, I also stopped explaining things that people were actively invested in misunderstanding. And that showed up a lot this year. Situations that, where the issue wasn't confusion, it was just about avoidance, where someone wanted a lot of reassurance without responsibility or validation without reflection. And those moments, more explanation didn't help. It just prolonged them being stuck. And another shift that was firmer was with my own limits internally and then externally, being clear about where my role starts and where it ends. And I've had to really firm that up. And it was difficult for me to do because you all know that I want to help. But my hands are tied on a lot of things. And I want you to understand it's not that I don't want to help. It's just that sometimes I'm constrained, you know? And what I'm willing to engage in and what I'm not. That doesn't mean I'm becoming, rigid or detached. It just means I'm not carrying things that don't belong to me. And I think earlier versions of me were more willing to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood or to absorb that frustration in the name of being helpful. But this year for me clarified that being endlessly available doesn't make work better. It just makes it less honest. So what replaced that wasn't withdrawal. It just means I got more steady and I let things be a little bit simpler. So a lot of times I said less when more wasn't needed. And I had to trust that if something mattered, it would, they were going to meet me halfway instead of requiring all the effort to be on my side. And I also became more comfortable with letting silence do some of the work. I didn't want to as much as I wanted to rush in and fill the gaps, I just didn't. And I didn't want to resolve every tension. Sometimes letting people sit with their own reaction is to something than trying to help smooth it over. Sometimes we got to go through things just to understand them. None of this came from a single decision that I made. It was gradual and it came from watching a lot of the patterns that I see and realizing that my job isn't to override limits, mine or anyone else's, but it is to notice them and to respond in the right way. And that stance feels more sustainable now. It's more honest to who I am. And frankly, it feels like a better foundation for the conversations I want to keep having going forward with you all. Because if I have limits and I'm going to stick by them, maybe by proxy, you're going to learn your own. And that's the start of something really good. Now, I want to switch gears here for a minute. I wanted to open up part of this end of the year wrap up, and I wanted to add some questions to this. So I figured instead of just tying everything up with a neat little bow here, I'd move into some of those and see where they were going to take us. And you all didn't disappoint, and I truly appreciate it, right? Because they line up with a lot of what's been floating around this year anyway. The same themes, different angles. You're going to probably hear some of the same questions enough times that they're going to start to feel familiar, like background noise that you can't just even unhear. And I'm not going to set this up too much. I'm going to read one, I'm going to talk through it, then I'm going to move on. I'm not going to be trying to do big frames or, a lot of bows here. Some of these are things people have been asking in one form or another for years now. Different places, different words, but the same tension underneath. So if it feels a little bit unfinished in spots, that's probably just accurate. Most of the stuff didn't land cleanly. It does just hang there for a bit. And there's a reason why I let it do that. And that's fine. All right. So let me get to the first one. So, the first question out of the US, from the West Coast, place that I'm familiar with. The question was, I'm having trouble explaining submission beyond sex. I don't really know what a real Dom sub relationship looks like day to day, and I don't want to end up in something abusive. It's a great question. And I think a lot of people struggle with this one because I believe, first and foremost, I want to start with, and I will die on this hill, BDSM and sex are not synonymous, right? You can negotiate them into your dynamic, but if somebody can't see that, if they're making that demand that it must be in, that's fine for them, but that doesn't mean it's fine for you. So then that means you have to decide if that's the dynamic you want to enter, right? But a lot of the confusion here comes from thinking that submission is something you just perform instead of something that lives inside of a relationship between two adults. Now, outside of sex, healthy DS is usually pretty unremarkable, right? People still have stress. We've got bad moods. We have disagreements and we got limits. So the power exchange doesn't replace any of that. It sits on top of that. Where things go sideways here is when submission starts to mean shrinking or toleration of something they don't want to or confusion and trying to earn safety by being agreeable enough. So that's not devotion, that's anxiety trying to feel secure. And what that actually why that actually matters is how power is handled when things get uncomfortable. When someone says no and when the expectations don't line up. That's where safety shows itself or it doesn't. So I do hope that answers your question. Thank you. This next one, I've got questions, by the way, guys, from all over the world. So I'm going to be saying the cities, and because I'm not going to say people, I'm going to say the cities and their countries because it just blows me away. I got this one from Osaka, Japan. Um, so I'm really, really happy, and I wish I could say hello to you in Japanese, but I just can't. Can't remember any Japanese. Where I live, not causing discomfort is valued more than saying what you feel. I've gotten very good at staying quiet. Now I don't know what I want anymore. How does this happen? That's a good question. When harmony is prioritized over early, the self often gets trained out of awareness, right? You learn to track the room instead of how your body's responding. And that doesn't happen all at once. It happens very slowly through really small acts of suppression that are rewarded as you being mature. Now, over time, desire goes quiet, not because it's going to disappear, but because it never gets exercised. So, what you're describing here isn't about personal failure, because it's not. It's a nervous system that learned safety through invisibility, safety through shrinking. And now it doesn't know how to speak up without being fearful. So, you got to try very small acts and align your boundaries. This next one is from Manchester, Man United, UK. Yes, I love soccer. I can talk about feelings, but I feel ridiculous needing reassurance. Why does it feel embarrassing to ask for it? Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, it's a really good question. All right, so the simple answer, because emotional fluency doesn't always include emotional permission. What do I mean? Being able to name feelings is different from believing your needs are welcome. So reassurance here can get framed as indulgent or even unnecessary, right? Especially in cultures that value restraint. So the shame isn't about the need, it's about having learned that needing anything too clearly makes you a burden. And that's why you're struggling with that. My friends, I got a feeling I think I know who this is. I'm not going to call you out, but from Riyadh, I have a feeling I know who this is from, right? But I'm not going to say anything. From Saudi Arabia, right? Choice already feels limited where I live. How do I explore submission without disappearing inside of it? God, I get this question a lot. It's a really good question. And I'm going to also try to apply your cultural understanding to this. So, the reason why I'm trying to do that is because your question here carries a lot of wisdom in it. When external freedom is constrained, the line between choice and compliance can blur quickly. Submission that's healthy still protects internal agency. So you should feel more grounded, not smaller. So when power exchange asks you to silence parts of yourself you already struggle to express, it stops being chosen and it starts becoming another place you're just going to vanish. From Toronto, Canada, I'm very patient, very understanding. All right. People praise me for it. Interesting. But I'm tired all the time. What am I missing? All right, well, you're probably carrying more than your share while calling it patience. So, being endlessly understanding can look like emotional maturity here while you're quietly functioning as self abandonment. So, patience doesn't lead to movement or repair. It turns a way of avoiding conflict at your own expense. And that fatigue, that's often the first honest signal that something's out of balance, and you need to listen to that. Israel from Tel Aviv. Strong emotions feel real to me. Calm feels like avoidance. Is that just how I'm wired? Uh, okay. Strong emotions creates immediacy, right? Feels alive and honest and undeniable. Calm doesn't come with that same intensity though, especially if early connections involved, urgency in your life or even volatility. And given your location, I can understand that. Calm can feel suspicious because it doesn't activate the nervous system in familiar ways. That doesn't mean calm is dishonest, right? That's the difference here. It just means that your body hasn't learned to trust the quiet again. I know who this is. I've spoken to you before, so thank you for writing. And I actually kind of picked it because this is all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. And you've written to me before. You wrote to me last year too, so I thank you. And I thank you for listening. God, I would love to visit. All right. Keeping peace is expected where I'm from. I've been doing it since I was young. At what point does that stop being a strength? All right. So peacekeeping is often starts as survival. You learn to read everything that's going on around you so you can soften the tension and you can anticipate what everybody wants. So those skills get rewarded. Now, over time, they turn you into a role you don't even remember agreeing to. So it stops being strength when your own needs only show up as exhaustion or even resentment because there's no space left to name them directly because that feels overwhelming. So you have to actually start putting yourself a little bit more first and being a little bit more honest about what you want and then let the other people sit with that. Okay. Melbourne, Australia. Stability sounds good in theory, but when things settle, I feel flat. Why? Because stability doesn't stimulate the nervous system the way unpredictability does. If closeness once came with, I don't know, effort and emotional spikes, all the steadiness in the world can feel dull at first. That flatness isn't absence, it's unfamiliar regulation. So learning to stay is going to take you time. Moscow, Russia. Wow, really? Oh, I just looked. Wow, awesome. Sorry, you guys got to realize I don't really. People listen to different quiet places, so I'm always really excited when I know people are. Authority feels familiar to me, sometimes comforting. I've heard this one before. How do I know when it stops being safe? All right, I kind of just answered this before, but familiarity can feel regulating when unpredictable things have always felt threatening. So, authority can provide you structure and rhythm and relief. The shift happens when disagreement becomes dangerous or choice starts narrowing that field. So, safety here is going to expand your agency. Control, even subtle amounts, eventually contracts it, right? Hola, Mexico. I grew up with strong family expectations. Yes, I do understand that one. Leaving or choosing differently feels selfish even when I'm unhappy. Why is it so heavy? That's because your loyalty is often tied to your identity long before your adulthood. So if you choose yourself, you're going to feel like you're breaking some sort of moral rule here, not just changing direction. The weight you feel isn't about the present relationship alone, it's about all the generations of expectations living inside of your nervous system. There is potentiality of generational trauma, but that's not what I'm going to get into. Vancouver, Canada. Vancouver. How do I know if I'm giving someone time or just avoiding the truth? Time that's useful has movement. Avoidance feels like stillness dressed up as patience. So if nothing is actually shifting for you, you're just managing disappointment and your body already knows the answer that your mind is just postponing. Seoul, South Korea. South Korea. 안녕하세요. I've been there. Responsibility equals worth where I'm from. Yes, it does. Wanting less emotional load feels like failure. How do you undo that? All right. We're a little bit borderline here, but I'm going to go ahead and I'll answer this one. So, when worth is earned through responsibility, rest feels unsafe. So, letting go of that emotional labor does trigger guilt rather than relief. So, undoing that isn't about becoming less caring, it's about separating value from usefulness, right? Hopefully that makes sense. That's going to take some time and repetition, right? That's not just about the inside alone. You got to practice it. Bucharest, Romania. In my family, leaving means you didn't endure enough. I've spent some time studying about Romania recently. Even when something hurts, less staying feels like the right thing. Why is that? You guys are pushing my boundaries a little bit here. All right, this is a little bit soft. I'm going to answer it anyways because your endurance often is getting mistaken for your character, right? So leaving is going to challenge the identity that you built, which is probably somewhere around loyalty and sacrifice. The pain isn't just about the relationship, it's about stepping outside of a role that probably made you feel like you belong. New York, New York. Everyone talks about emotional intelligence, but people still react badly when things get uncomfortable. Why? Well, that's because language develops faster than regulation. So, knowing the right words doesn't mean that your nervous system can tolerate what's going on or the disappointment or the rejection, pardon me, or even the ambiguity. Under stress, we default to what our bodies know how to do, not what they believe in, right? Hopefully that makes some sense. Joburg, South Africa. I'm told I'm resilient, but I feel worn down. So your body's telling you something here. How do you tell the difference? Well, okay, resilience here restores over time, right? You build it back up, the stores go up. Endurance just keeps you going. So if your strength never results in relief or even repair, it's probably being used as some sort of substitute for support. I'm going to mispronounce this, and I'm really sorry. Tallinn, Estonia. I feel calmer when somebody else decides things for me, but later I feel smaller. Why both? Handing over decisions here can quiet your anxiety when responsibility once felt unsafe. The calm is real, right? But there is a cost. And when choice keeps shrinking, the nervous system starts to protest in quieter ways. Colombia, Bogota. Wow. Okay. My relationships feel intense and alive, but they never settle. Why do I keep choosing that? Because intensity can feel like connection when steadiness maybe hasn't felt safe. The body's going to always reach for what it knows, even when the mind wants something else. So, familiarity here often wins before reflection gets a chance, right? So, you're going to have to think about that one. Dublin, Ireland. Ending things feel worse than staying, even why staying hurts. That's interesting. Why? I wrote about this earlier this year. That's because staying preserves what you know, right? The story's intact, even if it's painful. Leaving forces you to grieve and deal with uncertainty, but familiar pain often feels safer than the unfamiliar relief, even when relief is what you're actually asking for. Stockholm, Sweden. Everything looks equal here, but emotionally I'm always adjusting. Why does that go unnoticed? Well, when equality is assumed, Imbalance just stays invisible. Emotional labor here doesn't actually announce itself. It just accumulates very quietly until you start getting to the point you're so tired or fatigued that the only honest, that becomes the only honest signal left that you have in your body. Dubai, UAE. Wow, a couple of you. All right. Some of you, some of what I do feels chosen, some feels expected. I can't always tell which is which. When expectations are strong and conversations are limited, choice and compliance can blur. Chosen feels okay. I was reading. All right. All right. Um, well, bottom line, expected compliance is going to feel automatic. So you need an internal check-in that matters more than that external label you're carrying is probably the easiest way I can say it. Right? Valencia, Spain. Oh my. Yes. Hola. Hola, España. All right, in my culture, sex is talked about openly. If you all don't know, in Spain, they have a very liberal attitude about talking about sex. It's even joked about, but emotional struggle stays private. Oh, okay. I feel the split between what I want and what I'm supposed to keep to myself. Okay, so here, when desire is public but vulnerability is hidden, you're going to learn how to divide yourself, right? So one part wants one thing and another part is going to minimize or judge. And that internal split creates more distress than the desire itself, right? Mental health isn't about erasing want, it's about integrating it without shame or secrecy or even a self attack, right? Um, there were some more questions. I don't have time to get to them before the end of the year. I just wanted to get to these. Again, I'm really thankful for these coming in, right? So before I wrap all of this up, I I want to say thank you again, right? To all of you who've stayed and you've listened and you've come back when the conversations weren't comfortable or neat, or sometimes it even maybe felt like I was attacking, right? This year didn't offer a lot of certainty, but that was kind of the point, right? It offered you a chance to start thinking and moving inside of yourself. And this year really asked even for discernment, not more answers, not even a better language, just a clearer sense of what you can tolerate, what costs you too much and what your body has been trying to tell you all along before your mind even caught up. And a lot of that work wasn't about fixing anything here, right? It's about noticing these patterns sooner, pulling back maybe even a little bit, earlier. And you need to understand that trusting that discomfort isn't always something just to override. And from my end, that's the direction I'm staying in. Fewer explanations coming forward, more attention to what actually happens when the talking stops. That's where the truth is going to show up anyway, in that pause, right? In the part of you that doesn't rush past it. So as this year is starting to close out for all of us, no matter where you are or wherever you're listening from, I hope you get a little bit of quiet, a little bit of rest, maybe some space from trying to get everything right. Now, whether you celebrate Christmas, I wish you a Merry Christmas, a very happy New Year, or maybe even just a few slower days where you can kind of relax. That's what I'm going to be doing. Um, Hopefully, there's something steady in this for all of you, right? Now, season 5 is going to definitely pick up in 2026. I'm probably going to not launch until, I don't know, mid to late Jan. I'm going to take a little bit of time off. I'm going to start prepping some shows for you guys, some new stuff, right? We're going to keep moving forward. Year 5, season 5, right? Same tone, a lot more honesty, right? I think Chris is going to be a little bit more direct. You're all going to go more direct. Aren't you direct enough? Nope, can never be direct enough, right? Responsibility. I'm going to pick a theme for the year and I'm going to kind of overlap it on a lot of my things, right? But I'm definitely there's not going to be any pressure here to arrive anywhere that you're not ready to be at, right? So until then, everyone, thank you. Take care of yourself, right? Look after one another. And remember, as always, be safe and stay kinky.